You're listening to the Colin Flaherty Don't Make the Black Kids Angry podcast. Stay tuned at the end of the podcast for a little inside baseball about what's going on with this podcast and how we are going to keep it going, how that might change or how it might stay the same. We might not have been the first one to jump on this whole idea of school officials refusing to discipline or suspend or expel black students who are guilty of some pretty high-level, violent, and disruptive behavior. We might not have been the first, but we weren't too far behind the first. But I tell you something, nobody's done more on it than we have. Nobody's talked about it louder than we have. Nobody's banged the drum more than we have about what will happen when you stop enforcing, when you let the most dangerous people stay in school, because instead of being predators, we have described these people as victims of white racism, and that's why they have to stay in school. How many, we've done over 100 stories on that. Now we get a story that, and the basis of the story, right, was the Obama era, a rule that said, listen, there's an enormous difference between black kids and white kids in discipline and in performance, and there's only one reason only for that difference, that disparity, that is white racism. Good Lord, that has done so much damage. Might have done more damage than anything else Obama did, and that's a pretty long list, isn't it, with a lot of competition. Now comes Paul Sperry from the New York Post, who's one of my favorite writers. He did a fantastic story last year. We'll talk about it another time. He wrote a great book about the great bank holdup. And anyway, why don't we read Paul Sperry's article for some good news out of the Trump administration. Headline: Trump scrapping Obama-era rule that turned schools into war zones. The Trump administration plans this summer to scrap a controversial Obama-era discipline rule forced on schools to close racial gaps in suspension and arrests, but that critics say pressures educators to turn a blind eye to escalating bad behavior. Bingo! The federal directive, issued jointly in 2014 by the Department of Education and Justice, that's what gave it a little bit of zing, right? This wasn't just the Department of Education saying this. They brought in all the lawyers from the Department of Justice. That's kind of a unique situation. Anyway, this federal directive warned public school districts receiving federal funding, everybody, that they could face investigation and funding cuts if they failed to reduce statistical disparities in discipline by race. On average, the administration noted black students are suspended at 3 times the rate of their white peers. Pick a number from 3 to 10. That's what the real number is. The directive also discourages student arrests and holds districts liable for the actions of school resource officers or other law enforcement personnel. The one-size-fits-all federal policy, which recommends group counseling sessions and other alternatives to traditional discipline, like suspension and expulsion, has been foisted on several hundred school districts serving millions of students through investigation and threats of investigation that have continued into the Trump administration. The scope of it is breathtaking, said Max Eden, a guy at the Manhattan Institute. He said surveys show schools serving predominantly minority students have been hit the hardest by the resulting breakdown in discipline, with violence and chaos mushrooming out of control in urban districts. It's funny. When we're talking about what the school, when we're talking about what the white racism is inflicting on black students, it's all very clear. It's like white racism, black students are victims. But when we start describing the schools, then we have to start going the euphemism route. We don't do euphemisms around here. And in New York, Mayor de Blasio recommended all these different things to prevent suspension, including restorative justice, counseling, but more schools saw more fighting, disrespect, drugs, gang activity, etc., etc. Here's the money graph. While New York City school suspensions are down, Crime has spiked in cities' public schools. How many times have we said that? Talking about the funny numbers. Arrests down, crime up. Welcome to the brave new funny world of crime numbers in and out of schools. Current academic year has seen the first school murder in more than 20 years. A stabbing at a Bronx high school, the first time a gun was fired inside a school in more than 15 years. Blah, 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 more rapes, other sex crimes than any other year since 2007. Studies show similar results in 50 other urban school districts across the country. Flare-ups in violent behavior since softening their discipline codes. Here's another money graph. Large shares of teachers now say they feel unsafe as more and more students physically attack faculty and staff, according to the school climate and teacher surveys from dozens of districts, including Buffalo, Syracuse, Philly, and Denver. Yeah, we've done stories in each one of those places a couple of times. Plus a couple dozen more. Goes on and on. Parents saying, our schools are dangerous. Surprise! And we got other people saying, oh, we need the rules because it's all about civil rights. So it's going to happen this summer, and they haven't officially announced it yet, but they are cutting out the funding for that program right now. You remembered we've already done this like 3 times, so I won't do it again. Leslie Stahl brought this up just on 60 Minutes 2 weeks ago, where she reminded the Secretary of Education of the greatest lie of our generation, which she believes, which is that black students and white students are doing the same thing in schools, but white racist teachers are picking on black students, well, while letting the white students go. Fairy tale. Even so, we still are getting more and more stories just like this one from Milwaukee, where the schools are, where crime and violence in the schools are out of control. People in Milwaukee know it. But everybody just wants to keep on giving us this fairy tale explanation of white racism and black victimization. Let's check out this story from Milwaukee, because I think we're going to start seeing a lot fewer of these pretty soon.
Now, at that same meeting, students hope to bring attention to what they call racial disparities in the district. Ricky Mitchell is live outside MPS headquarters with the latest. Ricky.
Well, Carol, the district says it wants to hear student suggestions about how they can fix things within the district. And this comes after an investigation by the Department of Education found that black students are suspended at a much higher rate than white students. These students say current discipline policies at MPS criminalize black students and create a hostile learning environment.
It makes us feel like, are we here to learn or are we here to be policed?
Joya Headley is a junior at the Milwaukee School of Languages, where she says there are no metal detectors or officers. But she wanted to speak up after learning about a lengthy investigation by the Department of Education's Office for Civil Rights. Findings from that show that in the 2013-2014 school year, while black students made up 55% of the district's population, they represented 80% of both suspensions and expulsions.
And the money that we're spending on policing schools isn't actually helping the issues, because obviously the issues still occur.
The Department of Education and MPS reached an agreement to make changes in the school's policies, including making sure discipline is applied to all students regardless of race.
And I get that MPS is trying to do that, but let us know, be open with us about this.
A spokesperson for the district says they are working with students at high schools and middle schools to get feedback, and that this is a long-term process in the beginning stages. The district also says it's committed to reducing the disciplinary disparity noted in the complaint. Now, the district says it's also working to set up listening sessions so that parents in the community can weigh in on this as well. Those are expected to take place next month.
For all the stories we do hear on black mob violence and how it's so wildly out of proportion and how so many reporters are in denial, deceit, and delusion about it, that's only the tip of the iceberg. During the 8 years of the Obama administration, it's really hard to convince people, to get people to grok how deep their worldview was, their entire worldview was, where they looked at everything through the lens of race, everything. And I was telling somebody that this morning, when I hang around with people you might call civilians, and they gently bring up my topic, and I don't want to be one of these people that when I start talking about this, I don't shut up for 45 minutes in a social situation. But what I said was, listen, it's a lot deeper than just crime and violence and denial, deceit, and delusion. And I was thinking of this story from Paul Sperry in last year's in the New York Post, which I did a big story, which I covered in Don't Make the Black Kids Angry. Sperry wrote a great book on the housing crisis, how that all came tumbling down, and what happened here, which I saw firsthand, by the way, and what happened. What Sperry described in the housing crisis also happened in the car loan business, and how the people in the Obama administration they started going after people who make car loans because they did this huge spreadsheet, and they saw that Hispanic and black people were paying slightly higher rates. Let's listen to what happened to that bank, and let's take a look at some of the inside documents. This guy Paul Sperry, one of my favorite writers now, let's look at the story he tells about this crazy level of racial hostility, black and white, and how they use the federal government to enforce this racial preferences on a very big and expensive scale. So here's the headline. Bank CEO reveals how Obama administration shook him down. This is the most powerful opening paragraph I've read in a story in a very long time. Quote, the former CEO of Ally Financial, Inc. says the Obama administration abused its power by holding the bank's business hostage in order to coerce a record settlement of, quote, trumped-up racism charges and push profit-killing new regulations on the entire auto lending industry. The huge $100 million deal has spooked several other major lenders into resolving similar race-biased charges and offering below-market rates to minorities for car loans. That's how we got into the housing crisis, people. They were giving out lots and lots of home loans because of Barney Frank. They were giving out home loans to people who had no business getting a home loan, but Barney Frank forced the banks to do it because they said the banks were not lending money to black people and Hispanic people because banks were nothing but a bunch of white racists. And when all of a sudden the loans came due and the loans started defaulting in crazy levels, that was the first domino that tipped over the whole thing. Let's get back to the article. Michael A. Carpenter, who is at the head of the Detroit-based Ally from 2009 to 2015, said in an interview that Obama's powerful consumer watchdog agency threatened to derail the bank's efforts to obtain key regulatory approvals if it didn't agree to settle the allegations out of court. That's what we call blackmail. Quote, to be strong-armed by a regulator was inappropriate to say the least. He said they absolutely knew they had tremendous leverage over us. He goes on to talk about how he says there's no merit to these accusations. They are a means to a political end, forcing car dealers to abandon discretionary pricing and equalizing credit outcomes regardless of borrower credit worthiness. He said doing that, if they did that more and more and more, that would be signing the death warrant for the entire industry. Lots of people agree. This guy Sperry said the Consumer Finance Protection Bureau, the creation of Obama, that was kind of like the NAACP with subpoena power. Blah, blah, blah. We fought these trumped up accusations in every court, and we would have fought these trumped up accusations if paying back the American taxpayer had not been the compelling priority. Quote, they were using us as a way to regulate the industry, and unquote, and it may be working. Several of the other nation's biggest lenders, including Toyota, Fifth Third Bank, and American Honda Finance, have agreed to change the way they figure interest rates and a handful of other banks have agreed to adopt flat fees. Here's where it gets, here's the money graph. A confidential Consumer Finance Protection Bureau memo detailing how the agency would go after Ally strongly confirms the strategy. The October 2013 document says being able to roll the financial giant would, quote, send an important message, unquote, to the entire auto finance industry to eliminate discretionary pricing or face similar charges of racial discrimination. There's no intellectual honesty in their approach, said the former head of Ally. It's interesting to note that this was not one black or Hispanic person came forward and said, yeah, I got a higher loan because I'm black. This was something manufactured out of whole cloth by these bureaucrats who had nothing better to do. The fundamental premise on which they based their case was not true, and they knew it, but they didn't care. You could show them all the data on the planet, they did not care. They had an agenda, said Carpenter. Worse, the CFPB could never identify the alleged 235,000 minority victims harmed by the loan markups. So the agency had to resort to guessing race by last name and zip code, a so-called proxy method that's wildly inaccurate and often misidentifies white people as black. Carpenter said 20% of the checks that the government is now mailing out to people are probably going to Caucasians. Quote, we didn't want the same problem again, as Carpenter said, so we said to ourselves, what are we going to do to make sure we pass the fair lending test, unquote. And in fact, the industry is now having to pay protection money to the government as a cost of doing business. Quote, if that's the way you get their metrics right, he said, that's the way you have to play the game. So Ally decided, it's better to join them than fight them. So all of a sudden, in the last year or so, we've been seeing all these Ally commercials pop up featuring all the warm and fuzzy things Ally is doing for black people. Maybe you've seen them. Maybe they were kind of jarring to you. They seemed a little bit out of place in a car loan business. Now you know why. Why don't we take a look at a couple of these commercials?
I grew up in the projects, and so home ownership was not an option for us. I am taking the steps to own a home because I want my children to know it's all so that they can have a better life. Oh my gosh. This is amazing. We're so much closer to home ownership.
Years ago, me and my wife was actually saving for a house. But one day we were sitting there and we decided that, you know what, something needed to be done about what was going on in our inner city. Instead of buying the house, we decided to form this youth league.
What is he doing wrong?
He should shut the block.
Exactly. Why is
It's volunteer. We don't get a paycheck. It's 100% from the heart. Football shaped my life, and I'm praying that it shaped these kids' lives as well.
My mom brought us to the United States from Nigeria because she wanted to give us a different type of opportunity to go further with our education. In doing that, she sacrificed a lot. The main reason I wanted to get my PhD was to continue my mother's purpose in bringing us to this country and to build a foundation here for my family.
I've met a lot of conservatives who think that people who are business leaders walk straight out of the novel Atlas Shrugged. They're going to fight for private property. They're going to fight for their rights to run their business. They're going to fight for their right to do what they can to make a buck or two. No, that's not really the way most CEOs are. For every guy running Chick-fil-A's or that, what's it called, Hobby Lobby shop, there are hundreds and hundreds of guys who just, they're very, very pragmatic. And if somebody walks in and says, listen, our competitor just got hit by this huge suit, they're coming for us, we don't want any part of that, let's change. It's better to switch than fight. Let's change because we don't want the federal government coming in here and ruining our business by accusing us of being a bunch of white racist pigs who won't give free stuff to black people. Yes, that's the way the world was working under Obama. I know, that's astonishing to me too. It's astonishing that it happened. It's astonishing it didn't get more attention. It's astonishing, I guess it's not astonishing, that more reporters didn't talk about this, write about this, become a topic on Fox News. So when I fired up this podcast in January, I thought, well, let's just do this for a couple months. Let's see what kind of reception it gets. Let's see how much time it takes. And let's see if it's worthwhile for everybody involved. And man, I'm very grateful for all the reaction we get to this podcast, all the people who listen to it, all the people who pass it around. Thank you so much. You're listening to a dog howling at an ambulance. Yeah, you don't get that on any other podcast. I promise you that. Anyway, so I started this off really at the urging of one of our big supporters, who said, well, let's just see if we can get this podcast going, and if it kind of takes off, well, we'll keep doing it and we'll make some investments in it to make it even bigger. And so we're right at the point of the podcast now, right at the inflection point. Either it's just kind of going to stay here, or it's going to just keep growing and get in and become a lot bigger and more listened to than it already is. I mean, already right now, this podcast, even though we've only been doing it for 3 months, it's basically the equivalent to listening to the audience size is basically the equivalent of, say, listening to a mid/smaller market talk radio show. But one of the things I thought we might be able to do at the beginning was we'll start it off, see if anybody responds to it, which you have. Thank you very much. And if people really respond to it, then we could start maybe make it a subscription-based thing. That's where we are right now. I kind of don't want to do that. I like the idea of just people being able to discover this and listen to it without subscribing to it. And you guys have helped with that a lot, because a lot of people on this podcast, they'll listen to a podcast and they'll say, hey, Colin, you're the only guy doing this out there. You're the only guy speaking plainly about this incredible level of black criminality and the denial, deceit, and delusion going along with it. And all without racism, without rancor, and without apology. And so I'm very grateful that, for people who plunk $5 or $10 into my PayPal account, or if you go over to minds.com, you'll see a little lightning bolt. You click on that. There's an opportunity to drop a few coins in the cup there as well. But really now we're at the point where it's like, okay, do we make this a subscription, or do we just keep relying on the kindness of strangers to make this happen? Well, that's really up to you now, right? So we have a lot of options. If we can keep this going every day, that's what I want to do. But the only problem with doing it every day is that it takes a lot of time. A podcast takes way more time than a video for some weird reason. It just does. I don't mind the time, but what I do mind is that the time I'm spending on my podcast, I could be spending formulating my books, which are 2 more books, which are essentially written. I just have to get to and edit and do all the things that books take to do. But the podcasts and the videos, well, they're like shots of adrenaline, right? I mean, you do a book today, and the things we're writing about today happened a month ago. So that's why I really like the podcast, and I think that's why a lot of people respond to them. So if you like this podcast, if it's worth something to you, go to my PayPal account. My email is colin@colinflaherty.com, or go to my Minds and drop a few coins in the cup. And if we can keep it going, that's what I want to do. Another option is I might just lower it down maybe to 3 times a week and not worry about whether good old Colin stuffing a few coins in his pocket every once in a while to help keep this going. Because really right now the choice is, do I do the podcast or do the books? And it's really a choice between, it's some kind of combination, right, of what people want to get and what I have to do to keep my body and soul together. So anyway, thanks for all your help on this podcast. Thanks for sending me all the stories. Thank you for all the contribution. Thanks for all the encouragement. It's It's amazing how sometimes like I pretend this like never happens, but every once in a while I'm doing something or I'm just in the middle of something and I look at it and go, man, there's so much to do here. So much to do. Is it really worth it? Then I'll get an email from somebody saying, Colin, because of you, this happened to me. This happened to my family. Because of you, we didn't move into this neighborhood. We moved into that neighborhood. Because of you, I was able to get my mom out of that house in that black neighborhood where she grew up, where old white people are targets, and move her into a much safer place. And so what I thought when I started this, I thought this was a media book. I thought it was a story about exposing the media, how they just do a lousy job of reporting anything to do with race, how they just can't get it right. So that's what we kept documenting, right? The violence, denial, violence, denial, violence, denial, deceit, delusion. But then you guys morphed it. You morphed it. You started telling me what this channel was really about. It's really about that, secondarily, but primarily, it's really about people using these things to let their friends know what the way the world was really working, and how if they don't understand that, they might put themselves and their families in danger. And maybe this is the kind of thing somebody has to explain to their spouse, or their kid in a college, or their kid getting out of college, moving into a black neighborhood, or their aunt or their uncle or their friends. It's amazing how wide of a net this thing has. So I'm constantly astonished and grateful for how people respond to what we're doing here. I'm very flattered when people send me the emails, they send me cigars, they send me hats. People send me a lot of stuff, and it really helps me to keep going. So thanks for all of that. And man, let's just keep, and as far as I'm concerned, we're just getting started on this. I am just trying to figure out how to focus my energies to get the most out of, what we are all doing together. And that, of course, is not making the black kids angry.